$300. That's all this phone is asking for, yet it provides so much. But even if this small price point and big performance mean that this phone could be for anyone, there are some things to consider. Hey, it's Joshua Vergara. What's going on, everybody? And it's time to ask the question, who is the Pocophone F1 for? As usual for my reviews of this format, there is a standard disclaimer. This is not an exhaustive list. If there is a user you think I missed in this video, let that be known in the comment sections down below. Give a description of that user and why you think this phone is for them, and I might highlight that comment in my social media or in the community tab here on YouTube. We're going to start off with some obvious ones, and we're also going to start with who this phone is not for. Half the world. I was really bummed out when I first saw this phone and they said that this was not going to be made available in the US. Maybe I shouldn't have been too surprised because Poco's parent company is Xiaomi and many of their phones are not made available in the West either. This phone recently was just released in India, where the phone didn't really hit that $300 US equivalent price point, but it's still very cheap compared to many flagships and high-end phones out there. But the other reason why this is important to consider is because if you're planning on taking this phone and importing it into the West, you have to know that there aren't going to be all of the bands needed for LTE connectivity. Even when I went to a small vacation in Cabo in Mexico, I only got 4G HSPA Plus connectivity. I used the T-Mobile network on here, including Project Fi from time to time, especially when I was traveling, and I got good call quality on here, so that was fine, but most of my review will be based on Wi-Fi. But even if this phone is not made for half the world, it is a pretty good phone for the traveler. If you are in those areas where this phone can take full advantage of the connectivity out there, then you can also use the dual SIM capabilities here if you are jumping from place to place. But there is also a reason why dual SIM is important. There are some countries where you want to have a SIM for calls and for text, and then you have another SIM made specifically for data. There are places like in the Philippines where this is a feature that is used to its full potential. There are a lot of people in developing countries who require that kind of configuration with their SIMs, so it makes a lot of sense and is probably really exciting for them to have a phone that is high-end yet low-priced. So taking the phone for what it is, this phone is for the Pragmatic. Poco themselves say that this phone is one that they expect users to just put a case on. That way they are able to protect their investment. Not necessarily the amount of money they put into it, but all of the greatness that is inside. That's not to say this phone is unattractive, it's just a lot more utilitarian than most of its flagship competitors. There's not a whole lot of metal on this phone. It's a plastic backing that comes in a number of different colors, and the Kevlar version that I have is definitely the sleekest of the bunch. It's also not shy about how thick it is. There is a large battery in here, and all of the internals mean that the phone has to be a bit thicker all around. But if it's for the Pragmatic, then it's definitely not for the fancy. I'm not a notch hater, but I have to admit that the Pocophone F1 has the most egregious notch I've seen on any smartphone. I mean, look at it. It looks like a face. And even on the bottom, there's a bit of a chin, so it just adds to the bezel that's around the 6-inch IPS display. So obviously this phone is about what use you get out of its features rather than just how good it looks doing them. But now that we're talking about that screen, I guess we can talk about one of the biggest controversies surrounding this phone. This phone is not really for the media junkie. So the screen is not all that bad. It's an IPS display that comes in at 6 inches when you factor in that notch, and you can turn off the notch if you don't want to have that cutting into your content. You can have a black bar at the top so it kind of looks like it blends in, and that also makes it blend in better with the chin on the bottom. The colors are pretty good, they're rendered quite well, and enjoyment on media, especially in YouTube and whatnot, are perfectly fine. The problem is that you can't really view everything on this phone. So this brings me to yet another disclosure that I have. When I was given this phone, I told them to unlock the bootloader so that I could install the newest version of MIUI on here, which they previewed on one of the devices, but I haven't received yet on this phone. By unlocking the bootloader, it also means that the phone is unable to install certain DRM-based applications, and that includes Netflix. You may have already seen in a number of different places that Netflix does not stream HD content to this phone for the same reasons, DRM. So without apps like Netflix available for this phone, it really means that media junkies won't have the most enjoyment from this. You're gonna have to stick to something like YouTube, and maybe that's it. And that's a bummer because all of the internals really make this a great phone for a lot of different people, and one of them is the gamer. There is the Snapdragon 845 in here, which does a great job, and it's also backed by a cooling system. My edition has 6GB of RAM and 128GB of onboard storage that can also be bolstered by an SD card. And honestly, I've been having a really good time just playing a bunch of games on here. The IPS display does a good job, like I said, in rendering colors, and it is a 1080p panel, but that's more than enough for most of the games that I've played, whether in portrait or landscape modes. Even the recent release of Dragalia Lost looked pretty good on here, and I was able to enjoy it without any problems at all. So if the phone is really good for gamers, it's also good for those who are just trying to get some work done. So the software on here is MIUI, but it has also the Poco Launcher on here. The Poco Launcher is kind of a breath of fresh air if you've used MIUI editions before, because for one thing, it comes with an app drawer. But MIUI brings with it a few of its pretty interesting quirks, ones that you only see on Xiaomi phones, or in this case the Poco, including the second space, which allows you to create a whole different space for different applications, or just to have two different spaces, maybe one for play and one for work. It also brings the tools that Android provides, like multitasking via dual windows, and you can also get pretty easily between recent applications as long as you have the nav bar on. And as far as battery life is concerned, the fact that I wasn't able to use this properly with full connectivity means that I wasn't able to get proper tests done. I was mainly only able to use it on Wi-Fi, and in that regard, the 4000 mAh battery did a pretty good job. I never had any problems having to charge this before the end of the day, and there were some instances where on Wi-Fi I was able to continue on the second day because I had maybe 25 to 30% left. So with that in mind, it's obvious that this phone is not made for the Android purist. Thankfully on the Pocophone F1 you can have a nav bar, so you can easily use the configuration we're all used to, or you can move to full screen gestures, which I'm still not a huge fan of, and there's one thing that's really missing on here. By turning off the nav bar, you also eliminate one of the easiest ways to get to Google Assistant, but it also eliminates an easy way of switching between applications. You don't even have a bar down here to swipe left and right to easily switch in multitasking. One final peeve I have with the full screen gestures is the back function. You can swipe from either side of the screen in order to trigger a nice little animation that tells you you're going backwards. However, if you are swiping from either side, it might get in the way. For example, when I'm trying to erase full words in Gboard, sometimes I trigger the back function and it just infuriates me. Don't get me wrong, MIUI is looking better, especially with this particular launcher, and it does provide a few options that you don't get in stock Android. It's just a shame that even though you get a few extra things, you're also eliminating some fundamentals. One of the biggest question marks for a phone of this price is the camera, and I will say that this phone is for the casual photographer. The camera app comes with a few different options, even a manual mode, so you can change things up in a finite manner. The auto shooter even includes AI, and it tries its best to figure out what's in the frame and change the settings up accordingly, but mainly it just adds a little bit of color and maybe a little bit more contrast, and it doesn't seem like it's doing too much else on top of that. Photos look mostly good, especially in broad daylight situations, and I had a good time using this during my vacation in Cabo. In low light situations, however, it does kind of fall apart. It could use a little bit more dynamic range, and there's definitely some noise in the darker areas. This dual lens setup is a 12 megapixel shooter that comes with a 5 megapixel secondary depth sensor. Put together, those two lenses provide a portrait mode. And the portrait mode does a pretty good job. It does mess up the lines from time to time, like most phones do, but when it does a good job, you do get a nice blurred out background and a nice looking front subject. There's also a portrait mode on the front-facing shooter, which is a 20 megapixel camera, and it does get quite a bit of detail, but again, it kind of falls apart in low-light situations. Also, the portrait mode is even more hit or miss than the rear camera because it doesn't have that depth sensor to help it out. It's completely software-based. There is a beauty mode as well, and as usual with phones like this, if you turn it up all the way, you're going to look a little bit too different from who you really are. My girlfriend tried it out and so did I, and we found that if we wanted to get a little bit of the beauty mode in there just to make ourselves look a bit better, it's best to leave it around 1, 2, or in my case, maybe just leave it off altogether. And finally, some thoughts on video. 4K at 30 frames per second is alright with good detail, despite stabilization requiring use of the 1080p format. I did use it a little bit for some types of vlogging, but overall the video is nice, but not really one I would use to supplement my vlogs, unless it was the only camera that I had in my pocket. So with all that said, there's a lot to love about the Pocophone F1, and the best part about it is that it's made for the budget-minded. Like I said, there are a number of things that you have to keep in mind with this phone, but there are a lot of checks that it marks for that $300 price point. But the reality of it is that there are budget-minded people in every single market, and that's the reason why it's more of a shame that this phone is not made available in more markets. Like I told the guys over at Poco when I first saw this phone, if you were to put this on Amazon, it would destroy the other phones that are bestsellers because of their low price points, like Honor. And that really makes up the story of the Pocophone F1. It's a phone that we wish we could have here in the West. It's a phone that has a number of problems, but that's mainly because it's only available in those markets. A localized version of this could probably get to Netflix, it could get HD content on there, and it could skirt a lot of the issues that we have with the phone if imported into the West, like supporting all of the bands for LTE. So if you're looking to import this phone because of its low price, just know that there are are some things that you have to consider, and maybe in the future Poco will finally make the phone available here. Even if not quite at $300, it's still going to be less than the $1,000 plus phones that we have now. If you happen to be using the Pocophone in a market that it is made for, then let us know what your experience is in the comment sections down below. I think we all would love to hear that, and let's have that conversation in the comment sections as well. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and call it on this one. Thank you so much for watching my video on who the Pocophone F1 is for. If you think I missed any particular users, let that be known in the comment sections as well. And then, if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, make sure you do so, and don't forget to hit some likes on this video so you can see even more videos like this where I ask the question, who is this for? But with that said, I'm going to go ahead and call it on this one, and thank you once again for watching, and remember to enjoy your tea, everybody.